Fog lay low upon the canals, a milk-white breath drawn from the black water and held there as if Bravos itself were considering a reply. Bells spoke far off, dull as stones thrown into a deep pond. From nearer came the wet slap of oars and the whisper of rope through a gloved hand. Lamps bobbed along the embankments like slow fireflies. The house of black and white kept no lantern at its door, yet that door was never lost. The building found you if you were meant to find it, or so the faithful said. Tonight, the house had found a man who had once been a boy of the north, a boy called John. Within, the air was cooler than the night and scented with old stone and the faint sweetness of some oil burned long ago and long since extinguished. He stood before the pool that was half shadow and half reflection, its surface darker than ink, lighter than grief. Above it, the faces watched him. They watched even when his eyes closed. They watched in the blood's pulse at his temples, in the breath that rose and fell against his ribs. They watched in the quiet, and in the quiet John did not think of Winterfell's godswood or the snow that took sound and folded it away. He thought of names. "Name the thing you wish to be rid of," said the kindly voice that was not always kindly. "A man's first offering is truth." John kept his gaze upon the water. A ripple moved across it without a source. "I would be rid of anger," he said. He heard the old rasp the cold had left in him. He was not rid of that either. "Anger is a cloak," the voice said, coming from his left and then his right as if two people flanked him. "It is useful until it is heavy. Name something that is only a chain." He swallowed. The house had a way of simplifying matters into metals and bindings, of taking the flailing of the heart and calculating it like a tanner measuring hides. "Pride," John said, and the word was smaller than the thing itself, and he knew the house knew it. Silence. A soundless nod, perhaps. The soft shift of cloth answered him like the wing of a night bird. "The many-faced god takes chains first," the voice murmured. "Then cloaks. Then names. Then there is nothing left," said John. "Then there is no weight. A man with no weight does not sink, even in winter rivers." He did not say that some things were worth sinking for. He had learned the house's lessons the way winter teaches a man to keep his fingers. Slowly, at cost, with attention. He did not argue when taught. He pulled the lesson to himself and turned it around and around until its edges discouraged bleeding. He had come to Bravos with a coin the color of storms and a phrase like a lockpick upon his tongue. 2 men had died on the way. One had tried to gut him in an alley near the Ragman's harbor. The other had died because John had been clumsy in choosing how he vanished and whom he left blame for the vanishing. The house had not praised him. The house did not praise or censure. It corrected. He had learned to wear a face as one might wear a scent, noticed once and then accepted. He had learned to walk like a fishmonger who limped and like a sailor with a fondness for ale and like a boy who had served bread to rough men and never met their eyes. He had learned to sleep without sleep and to keep watch with everything but his eyes. He had learned to lay a voice over his own like a thin cloak over a broad one. He had learned to lie flat upon stone and listen to the building's weight, to count the heartbeats between settling and settling, to know when someone moved upon the floor above and when the titmouse came to the eaves to pick at spider silk. He had learned to kill as if he were replacing a rotten tooth in a jaw that needed to chew again. Jaqen had not always been present, and when he was present he was not always Jaqen. Once he was an old scribe whose hand shook only when he wrote a certain name. Once he was a woman with a birthmark that looked like a map of the summer sea. Once he was a boy with 2 scars that lifted his mouth into a permanent half-smile. Yet there were small things the faces could not change. A rhythm, a patience, a particular heatlessness even in kindness. And there was the way he sometimes spoke, sidelong and amused, as if he were flirting with the words themselves. "A man wonders," said the scribe one evening, blowing the dust from a ledger, "why a winter wolf has come so far from his den to learn to be missed." "Mist is patient," John said. "A wolf is patient only while he stalks. Then he springs and everything is sharp and wet. Bravos is fog, and fog eats the sharp edges. Fog eats a wolf and does not leave bones." John turned a page. These were ledgers of the dead. Names, amounts, the cost of poison purchased with candied orange peels or a silver ring with a chipped emerald, the price of a particular ladder at a particular wall. The house kept ledgers not because it loved sums but because sums taught the contours of decisions. He had learned that too. "I cannot be the mist," John said, "but I can learn to walk inside it without coughing." The boy with the half-smile sat across from him then, and in the boy's eyes was no boy at all. "A man has found a way to say he will keep his name while we ask him to give it up," he said, not without admiration. "This is clever and foolish as fire. It will warm a man and then it will burn him." "Some things should not be warmed," John said. He meant rage. He meant grief. He meant love, but he did not say love aloud in this place. He knew how the house's silence listened when a forbidden word entered it. The kindly man, kindly, unkindly, godly, and otherwise, set a bowl upon the stone and motioned to the pool. John knelt and dipped the bowl, and his reflection stuttered as if unwilling to be captured. Water dripped from the bowl's lip with the metronome's patience. "There are 7 in Westeros," the man said, as John steadied the bowl in both hands. 7 who are called by other names there. 7 who are the same one here. The stranger is our brother. The stranger wears many faces. A faceless man merely helps him change his mask." "I know the tale," John said quietly. "Then a tale. Once there were slaves who walked a mountain that burned and could not stop burning. The first gift was given to one slave who begged for release. Later, the gift was given to a master who would have burned another alive. Lies are a kind of burning, so is fear." Behind his eyelids he saw a cold courtyard, rime on stone, 3 men in black cloaks and the hoods of a mob. He kept his breath steady, because the house of black and white did not respect men who drowned in their own river. "Westeros," the voice continued, "is full of small burnings that feed larger fires. The cracking of a whip is a spark. A bannerman with a ledger full of debts he calls duty is a spark. A king is a hearth only if he warms his people. If he eats wood and pisses ash, he is a kiln, and kilns make pots for masters to drink from. A man has come far from home because he does not like the taste in his mouth." John lifted the bowl to the ledge and set it down. Water lapped like a small animal's tongue. "What would the house ask?" he said. The kindly man's mouth never moved when John thought it would. That was one of the face's common traits, a choice or a vow. "To give the gift where it is not requested," he said. "A dangerous thing. The gift becomes a sword then, and swords grow like ivy upon men like you." "I swore an oath," John said. "I have sworn many. I could swear another." "Do not swear here," the kindly man said, and for the first time John heard weariness in the voice, as if too many oaths hung in the rafters like stale herbs. "We prefer the obedience of the unbound. If you must name it a task." So it was named. The task did not belong to a single purse. There was no widow who had sold her last rings, no gambler with a desperate son, no merchant praying for a rival's cough. It had taken shape in the vaults of the Iron Bank and among quiet men and women who counted ships and winter stores and who could draft a war without once lifting a sword. It had taken shape in a place where they knew that tyrants could be starved like wolves if the rabbits stopped running in certain fields. It had taken shape because a man with mismatched eyes had suggested that killing one lord and another bred hydras. "Kill a habit," Jaqen had said, "and 100 heads fall off by themselves." They did not write that down. The house did not write those things down. At the Titan's feet the next morning, fog lifted in long scarves that caught on the statue's stony calves and wavered like surrender flags. John stood beside a skiff and watched the tide flecks along the pylons of a warehouse where salt dried in white beds and gulls wrote their own arguments upon the air. He wore the face of a man who had once captained a whaler out of Ibn. The nose was broken in a way that made breathing a lesson, and the cheeks were slightly hollow, as if wind had eaten them. The beard was miserliness itself, stingy and black-streaked with gray. His hands bore a sailor's stains. He did not like the way the face narrowed his world, but he recognized the usefulness of a discomfort that made him slower to speak. Jaqen came as a fishmonger's wife, a bulky woman with an apron that had seen better fish and worse husbands. The eyes laughed the way frying oil laughs. "A man is ready to ride no horse," Jaqen said, voice pitched midway between mockery and greeting. "There are not so many horses upon the narrow sea." "Boats will do," John said. "A man must learn to like what will do, and when he cannot like it, to love the task that makes it necessary." Jaqen stepped onto the skiff with a grace the apron did not promise. "We go to a white city with a green wolf. We go to a lord who eats pies and whose patience has edges." "White Harbor," John said, tasted less like home than like a clean harbor after a storm. "Wyman Manderley." "A man has read the ledgers," Jaqen said. "You have learned to keep the wolf's ears under a cap. Good. Do not use teeth. Not at first." "What then?" "Men who whip do so because the hand is cheap and quick. We will make the hand expensive and slow. There is a factor there whose numbers have bled the docks for years. He loves the law as a miser loves a chest of locked chests. He dreams of cages that look like tax codes. He has made a famine from paperwork. He is not a lord. He is the angle of a lord's blind corner." John watched a barge slide past, piled high with sacks of grain stitched in a pattern of crow's feet. The thought of a famine made him think of smaller mouths opening and closing with nothing to take. "Why not kill him?" Jaqen smiled like a cat watching snowflakes. "Because the hand would be replaced by another hand. We will find his wrists. We will find the way the hand thinks it is the head. And then, when the hand cannot stop the bleeding we will cause, the head will call for a knife to cut the hand away. We will oblige. But first we will build the knife and give it to the head." "And after?" John asked. "After the head will tell itself that it chose well. Stories matter." Jaqen pushed them off. The skiff moved like a question mark across the canal. "And if a head that eats wood and pisses ash calls for a knife for other hands, we will show it a mirror." They made the crossing with 2 cold-bellied sailors and a gull that rode their wake for the crumbs of stale bread Jaqen flicked without looking. The narrow sea knitted itself and unknitted itself beneath them. The wind carried its own tongues, all cutting. John took a turn at the tiller and thought of Ghost. In his dreams he still ran scant inches above snow, the air a thick cloth that he could claw and tear and taste. He did not always know which body woke first. He supposed it did not matter so long as both remembered the task. It was not fair to ask a wolf to be fog. But perhaps there were wolves in fog, and perhaps fog learned to move like a pack. The white city came up like a candle seen through milk glass. First a smear of brightness, then sharper, then stones upon stones, people moving along the quays in sturdy lines. White Harbor smelled of fish and flour and tallow and the iron tang of coin. Ships with antlers carved on their stems were tied alongside cogs with painted eyes. A man with a green sash and a scroll case walked faster than his shadow, which lagged behind as if burdened. Women in wool with blue piping called over baskets and gates. The wolf's den hunched against the winter sea. The old prison now made a guardian again. John watched as Jaqen became smaller, narrower, turned his apron into a ledger and his laugh into a sniff. By the time they stood at the foot of a warehouse with a hawk painted on its eaves, Jaqen was an assistant scribe with a smear of ink at the corner of his mouth, and John was the captain of an Ibanese whaler with a sore knee that clicked when he climbed. "Factor tolls," said Jaqen to the clerk at the door, and the name opened the door faster than a bribe. That was a lesson too. Men build locks and then teach their servants how to pick them. The house simply took notes. Factor tolls was the kind of tidy that made a man wish to knock over an inkwell. He wore his hair in a precise graying queue and his rings sat in a line upon a long finger as if awaiting orders. He smiled at them as a cat smiles at 2 birds arguing about how best to leap. "What can the master of tithes do for the harbors?" he asked. Jaqen produced a sheaf of papers thick enough to look important and thin enough to turn quickly. "We require only your signature, honorable tolls," he said. His voice was reedy and earnest, and anyone would have wanted to make him go away by giving him what he sought. "It is a correction, merely, a misclassification of salted herring as a taxable luxury." Tolls's mouth twitched. Salted herring is a luxury to those who do not eat anything else, he said, and his eyes slid toward John's knee as if calculating what the knee could be made to pay. No doubt the correction benefits those who suffered from this. He raised his brows delicately. Error. The city, said Jaqen, bowing and withdrawing a single letter with a seal that made Toll's fingers still. It was the Merman's Court's lesser seal, and it was genuine because the woman who handled the lesser seal had touched her forehead to the pool in Bravos once and whispered 3 names she could not bear to carry. A temporary alleviation during winter shortages. Temporary alleviations have a way of breeding, Tolls murmured. He took up a quill. To whom shall the refunds be dispersed? To the Barge Guild, Jaqen said, and the quill stopped again. Ah, said Tolls. He did not like the Barge Guild. The Barge Guild did not like him. This was the wrist. Jaqen had brought them to it with a soft step. Tolls tapped the quill against the rim of the inkpot like a man knocking on a skull to hear whether it is hollow. There will be audits, he said. Of course, Jaqen said. We would not wish fish to be mistaken for lamps. Tolls signed where asked. He signed 2 more places he did not see. He stamped once, twice, 3 times with seals that were not his to use but which Jaqen had made seem to belong, because belief can be ink when applied with the right thickness. When they left, John let the limp take him down the stairs slowly and listened to the city change very slightly around them. The Barge Guild would drink better and pay its oarsmen for overtime. Those oarsmen would buy meat on 1 more day of the week and beer of a better sort and boots that did not leak at the toes. A butcher who had owed Toll's cousin would pay late. The cousin would grumble to his wife, who would mention that the warden of the granaries had been seen playing sivas with a man who owned 3 ships, and neither of them liked how the knights from the south had begun to throw their weight around near the lighthouse. And around and around. The hand was not yet bleeding, but somewhere Bone had felt a crack, and Bone understood. 3 days, Jaqen said, buying 2 hot pasties and handing one to John, as if they were only men who had signed papers and grown hungry. In 3 days a barge will sink while tied to its moorings because the knot will be wrong. A moderate tragedy. An honest mistake. 100 sacks of barley will spoil. A neighboring warehouse will accept a transfer to avoid loss and will not be paid on time because the master's son has a cough and all things wait for coughs. The Barge Guild will tighten its belts and ask to delay the oarsmen's raise. The oarsmen will come to the Merman's Court with their caps in hands, and their caps will be filled with something unexpected. What? John asked. Coin? Said Jaqen, and he smiled. And now there was warmth in it, like a stove under a table on a bitter night. The Lord will pay, because he eats pies and his patience has edges. He will make a speech about the strength of the city. He will notice that the factor's ledgers speak mostly of squeezing smaller men, and he will discover that he has always preferred ledgers that spoke of narrower squeezes in a different direction. You make it sound like pushing a boat with 1 finger, John said. Most boats need only be nudged if you find the place the water pools. Most men too, Jaqen said. We will continue. Here elsewhere. Tyranny is a habit of turning toward the fattest sheep first. If the wolves learn that sheep kick and that shepherds count, if the dogs are fed better than the men who would starve them, the habit stumbles. Then a lord looks cruel without profit. That is a bad mirror. Men break bad mirrors quicker than they break habits. They ate their pasties with their backs to a wall that had known centuries of backs. Across the way, 2 boys tried to sell the same fish to the same man while pretending to be 2 different boys. The man laughed and bought both fish and was cheated twice and did not mind. A woman with scarred knuckles paid for oil and pinched the wick between fingers too quick for flame. The smell of the harbor thickened with noon. That night, John walked the city as a guard on the 2nd watch with a bad ankle and a gentleness for stray dogs. He touched doors. He listened to shutters. He watched a man who moved like smoke and a woman who moved like a bell clapper, and he counted the spaces where no one moved at all. The city had a pulse. You had to sit with it until the pulse you brought learned to beat a fraction out of time with it. He found the knot that would be tied badly and admired the simplicity of the future mistake. He found the boy who would tie it and left a silver mark where a boy might find it later when the right regret came due. He found the place where the factor's cousin would meet a man to mutter, and where the muttering could be overheard by another man who would tell another woman who would scratch out a name and write another. None of these were kills. The house had taught him that kills were loud inside a life, even when they made no sound in a room. On the third day, he was a porter who grunted gently under the weight of 2 sacks and said nothing to anyone. He came to the barge at noon, and the knot was wrong, and the creak of wet rope came like a cough in an old throat. When the sacks shifted and the barge lurched and the water came in a slap and then a shove and then a slow patient lift, there were shouts and scrambling and a chaos that moved like fish in a barrel. John did not move faster than the slowest two. He let the city see itself. The oarsmen turned their faces to the Lord's house, and the Lord's house saw them because it wished to be seen. The speech came that evening, fat and full of comfort as the pies the Lord loved. The coin came, the patience came to its edge and cut. Tolls was dismissed before dawn 2 days later. He was not killed. He went to a relative's counting house in Sisterton where storms come sideways and numbers grow salt crusts. He would fail there too because the wrist had been cut and the hand could not forget. Jaqen and John sat upon the sea wall at dusk with paper cups of boiled wine that tasted less of wine than of consequence. In the harbor, boys invented a ship with their hands and voices and sailed it toward the moon. A city is a lord too, Jaqen said. It can learn. Sometimes it is the kinder lord. And when it is not? John asked. He was thinking of the twins and the Boltons, and of a woman who had smiled with half her mouth and called herself Fry and Lannister by marriage, and he was thinking of a throne that cut while it claimed to support. Then a gift, Jaqen said. He set the paper cup down and the wind tried to lift it and failed. A man has shown he can put a knife in a hand. He will now show that he can put a knife into a heart and leave no stain. Whose? John said, though he had thought of several. 2, Jaqen said. His eyes, whatever face they wore, were careful when they named numbers. A knight in service to a certain dinner and a man who writes letters to people who pay men to write letters. The twins, John said, and the word had the feel of a plank beneath a boot, narrow, slick, unforgiving. And King's Landing. Names are not yet for saying, Jaqen said. A man knows wolves carry names that bite back. He rose. We will go by the sea path, then by the cattle path, then by a path that is not there until we walk it. Will it be enough? John asked. Enough is a cup that never fills, Jaqen said. But we can pour. We will pour until men begin to taste metal in what they have been drinking all their lives. When water tastes of iron, even tyrants remember that blood is in it. They left White Harbor in a fog that made the city an old woman with a shawl drawn up over her hair. The ship was a low-slung trader with a cargo of timber bundled so tightly that even the wind could not find its way between planks. John slept with his ear to the hull and listened to the sea speak in the oldest tongue. He dreamt of snow sighing off a branch and of a fox whose paws made no sound on the crust. He dreamt of a hall where banners hung too heavy and of a man with a slack mouth and a girl who held her own hands in her lap as if each were a child in danger of running away. He woke before dawn and sat with the sailors who pretended not to see that he did not belong among them. The wind turned. The trader took the change like a patient man changing lanes in a crowded street. They made the fingers and then the sisters and then the dark line of the riverlands, where everything on the horizon appeared chewed. The twins rose from the haze like 2 old teeth set in sore gums. John felt something old and narrow in him lift its head. The habit of a sword-finding palm, the urge to point and charge and die well if die you must. He put that habit in his lap and smoothed it like a hound's roused hackles. We will not be seen, Jaqen said, face and voice both modest. We will be the men who clean gutters. We will be the woman who moves the table so there is room for a fire to be brought in from the yard and a bench thrust back and a dog to hide under it. We will be the rope that pulls the meat into the rafters. We will be the break in the rope. Walder Frye will not change, John said. He is not a habit. He is the thing habits protect. Then, Jaqen said, we must strip him of his habits until he is cold. The cattle path was still the cattle path, though no cattle had walked it since the last levy took hooves and horns for stew. They came as tinkers who repaired pots with small circles of tin and the patience of saints. They fixed a kettle in the village nearest the crossing, and the woman who owned it told them how she spat when she said fry and how she had run out of spit this year and had taken to spitting words instead. They nodded without taking words from her. There was something valuable in leaving a woman richer after she had spent her anger. They mended a hook for an old fisherman who told them that the river could be made to lie if you put a dead pig in it at just the right bend. They mended a lantern for a boy who smiled too quickly and counted too well with his eyes when he thought no one watched. They gave him a mark to carry in his cheek for a day and asked him to bite down if a particular bell on the east tower failed to ring at sunset. "What if I forget?" the boy asked. "You will not forget a coin in your mouth," John said. They watched. They listened to the kitchens, which have their own politics and remember better than courts. They learned which sons went to which wives' beds by mistake when wine was thick, and which daughter kept her keys in a pouch at her throat, and how deeply she slept, and which steward scratched his ankle when he lied, and which hounds were gentlemen, and which would take bread from anyone. They learned that a certain knight, overweight on gravy and undeserved honors, had the habit of resting after supper upon a bench that had been poorly repaired 3 years ago and never mended properly because no one loved him enough to notice splinters. They learned that a letter writer in the Eastern Tower had a cough and took licorice for it, and the licorice seller owed coin to a man who liked to relieve himself from the parapet and measure distance by sound. The work was an arrows. 1,000 small things could be made to lean upon one another until a wall eventually noticed that it was falling. John had lived by swords, and the honor that pretended swords spoke clearly. He learned how quiet true violence could be when you taught it patience. He watched Jaqen hand a bar of soap to a scullion and say nothing. He watched the scullion wash his hands twice the next day because someone he wished to impress walked by with a basket of pears. He watched the scullion's clean hands carry a dish to the slack-mouthed knight, and he watched the knight's weight and the bench's memory meet at last. The crack was not loud, the fall not fatal, but flesh embarrassed often invites foolishness, and foolishness eats caution the way fire eats dry fern. The knight demanded another dish brought to his chambers because the hall was unkind, and the woman who moved the tables to bring in a fire earlier moved that table again, and in moving it she took the rope in her hand and let it slip, whether by mistake or because men who sneer at women's work rarely notice women's choices. The meat hung lower. Dogs leapt. A scuffle meant that doors were opened and then forgotten, and then the air moved as it should not have moved, and a candle flared and then extinguished in the draft, and a man who wrote letters disliked a draft because of his cough and closed one shutter and forgot another, and within that forgetfulness Jaqen's fingers wrote a different letter with a different seal, and the letter said something no fry would ever say, and yet it looked like what a fry might say if he had recently been bitten by his own habit. When the letter rode, it rode not to a lord but to a list of smaller men who kept larger men upright. It whispered of barrels short by 4 slats each, and of stone purchased that weighed half an honest stone, and of a levy that was bringing sickness with it where it went. Men who lived by the ledgers of loyalty do not like it when someone adds a column they did not know was being counted. Walder Fry did not feel the knife. He felt the itch of a cut healing badly. Now? John asked Jaqen upon the night the letter crossed the river on the same ferry that carried boys who were not yet brave and girls who were already so. The moon had ruined its face on a distant cloud and come away cleaned. Now, Jaqen said, and the word could have meant a day or a year or a lifetime. He looked toward the east, where there was a city that called itself king, and a queen who called herself peace, and a law that called itself order each time it was paid to say so. Now we teach the river to change its course, and then we teach the city to taste its own teeth. A man with a face and a wolf without one will walk together. John touched the pouch that lay against his breastbone. It held the coin that had brought him here, and a face he had not yet worn, and a bit of wool taken from a long-ago cloak that had once smelled of pine smoke and horses. He did not open the pouch. He did not need to. He stood upon a bank that had seen too many crossings. He listened. A bell did not ring at sunset. Far away, a gull cried in a voice like tearing parchment. The river moved. The habit of tyranny stayed where it was for one more night, and he felt the work like cold in his bones and like warmth in his palms, and he let both be. In the morning, they went south by a road that had forgotten what it was for. They wore the names of men no one remembered. They passed a shepherd who apologized to his dog when the dog stepped on his foot by mistake. They passed a woman with a cracked pot into which someone had set a very small flower, blue as a bruise and stubborn about it. They passed soldiers who thought themselves noble because their boots were recently washed. They did not pass a line of orphans. The orphans passed them as if waves pass stones, and one of the orphans, a girl with hair cut at home by a caring hand and a quick stare that would not soften for anyone's comfort, glanced at John's face in a way that made him wonder whether some truths have their own eyes. They made King's Landing by stages, as one eats a hard crust. The city stank of ambition and ash and human stew left too long upon a low fire. Spires were too proud, gutters too honest. Gold cloaks moved like a homemade army made by boys with sticks. The Red Keep sat upon its hill as if it had never lifted its skirt for any man, which was untrue and part of its power. The gates yawned when coin was shown and clenched when it was not. The markets argued with themselves. Men sold violations of laws written by men sitting on terraces discussing justice as if it were a spice they might buy if the price came down. Jaqen became a parchment seller whose fingers bore permanent gray half-moons. John became a guardsman whose pauldron rivets were one missing and one loose. They took a room above a place that sold stewed eels and fought cats at night. The letter writer they sought had a window that faced west and a mistress who faced east in temperament, and they met in the middle twice a week to speak of small embezzlements that soothed larger disappointments. Jaqen spoke to the mistress first. He paid well for the story of a stolen ring that had not in fact been stolen, and for the dates upon which the letter writer shaved, not because he was taking a petition to court, but because one must look one's best for disappointment. John watched the courts. A scribe there had the habit of passing notes to defendants' wives with sentences underlined in a beautiful hand. When to expect their men back, which jailers needed which coin, which jailers needed only to be asked kindly about their mothers. The scribe drank cheap wine and believed himself good. He was not bad. That was worse. It meant he floated. One evening, when the sun had become a peach and then a plum and then a dark thing one might toss at dogs, Jaqen came to John with a paper twist of licorice. "A man has a decision to make," he said. "We can cut 2 cords and the tent will fall. Or we can cut 3 and the tent will fall without anyone seeing the knife." John looked at the licorice and smelled the cough it answered. "What is the 3rd cord?" Jaqen looked toward the hill that had never lifted its skirt. "A name you do not want to cut. A man who believes he is the kind of man you would prefer to spare." "Then why cut him?" John asked, thinking of commanders who had been hard because the world was hard and of the way that hardness sometimes smoothed a little boy's hunger for justice into something that could make a bowl and hold water without leaking. "Because he is the habit that permits the others," Jaqen said. "Because he thinks he stands between cruelty and the people when he has merely learned to speak cruelty softly. Because men like him are mirrors polished by the hands of worse men and then placed in halls so that worse men can pretend to like what they see." He opened the twist and drew out a strip. He did not eat it. "Because sometimes you must take a good man away to show a better one what good is." John thought of the house's pool. He thought of names. He thought of winter, and of a story told in a stable to a boy who should have been a lord and was instead a bastard, and how both had been true. He did not know whether he was a man who could agree to such things and still be a man who could walk the snow and let his breath come out as fog and not worry whether it was a cloak or a chain. He felt ghosts stir in the part of him that lay closer to the ground, and he felt the old pull of a sword find his palm even when there was no sword there. "If we must," he said at last, the words heavy and chosen. "But if there is another way, we take it." "A man has always liked wolves," Jaqen said. "They do not kill for sport. They do not kill because their mouths like the taste. They kill because something must be eaten that others might live." He put the licorice back into the twist. "We will begin with letters. We will end with lips that do not move anymore. Between the two there will be a city that looks at itself and does not like what it sees for a long minute." In the days that followed, they nudged papers and pulled threads and watched the fabric sag where it had been bragging about its tightness. A petition of dockworkers' widows that had sat too long at the bottom of a stack climbed like ivy. An accusation against a gold cloak who had thrown a cobbler from a cart for the crime of existing, where he wished to drive sprouted witnesses who had been invisible until coin and care made them forget fear. A letter displeasing to a lord's temper arrived in the hand of a scribe who should never have carried it, which was the point. The Lord's temper fell where it was meant to fall, upon a man whose quiet corruption had fattened the wrong geese for too long. The city shifted a fraction. Fractions matter. Then the night came when the third cord must be cut or not cut. And John stood in a corridor that smelled of rushes and the breath of men who believed themselves important because others had never been shown a world without them. He wore a face that had no particularity. He carried a cup that steamed. The man inside the chamber had papers upon his desk and a wife in a country house and a son with a sweet tooth and a belief that he did hard things so that others would not have to do harder. He looked up and smiled at the servant who was not a servant and said that he liked the smell of the cloves and the wine and said that winter was bad for his joints and said that the law was a bear that needed a good handler and few men were. And then he stopped because the steam from the cup had changed and because he was clever enough to know what clever men sometimes miss, that he had become exactly what he had never wished to be. It could be otherwise, John said. His voice was a voice he had borrowed from a smith who had once told a boy to keep his hands away from the tongs. You could let the bear loose in the hall and lock the doors and make the men who feed it sit inside of it. The man looked at him, and for a moment John saw the man had wanted to be. He saw the way that man might have told the truth to the wrong ears and received a life's worth of silence in exchange. He saw the way habit had made a home and hung its cloak by a fire and saved a seat for compromise and took off its boots and never put them on again. He saw all that, and he almost set the cup down upon the desk to cool. But justice without consequence is a story told to children to make them sleep. When the man died, he did not suffer. When he died, he knew he was dying, and John let that knowledge be the last honest thing the man held. He closed the man's eyes and walked away without altering a single object in the room. The city would alter itself around the emptiness. Sometimes the shape of a man's absence is the only lever that can move a thing like a court. Later, upon the roofline where cats ruled and men came only to look at stars when stars promised not to look back, Jaqen stood with him and said nothing. The wind tugged at their clothes and made no progress. The city muttered beneath them. A bell rang that should have rung, and somewhere very far away and very near, another bell did not ring at sunset because a boy had bitten a coin too hard and learned that silver can cut. "We will go on," Jaqen said at last. "Yes," John said. "We will go where habits sit upon thrones and in kitchens and at the end of alleys." He paused. "It will be long. Winter is long," John said, and he did not mean only weather. He slept and dreamed of a godswood without leaves, of a weirwood with eyes that did not accuse or forgive, only saw. He dreamed of faces upon faces arranged around a pool, and the pool was not black, not white, but the color of breath on a cold morning. He dreamed of a man who could remove a name and of a boy who could not. He woke before dawn. He rose. He put on a face that would pass through men's disbelief as a needle passes through cloth. He took up the work. Somewhere west of the city and north of the river and south of a road that forgot itself at the edge of a field, a habit turned and found itself stared at by its own reflection and flinched for the first time. Somewhere upon a seaward wall, a lord who loved pies made a choice that would cost him comfort and buy him something rarer. The wind turned. The fog came up from the water and walked inland. In it, two figures moved, close as breath and patient as a winter that waits for the weak branches. They were not kings. They were not banners. They were men with knives that sometimes cut what you could not see and sometimes what you could, and the gift they carried had never belonged to them and never would. The mist accepted their passage. The city and the country beyond it would not accept what came so easily. That was all right. The task was long and they had time. The city began to speak differently, in an accent no one would have noticed a month earlier. It did not pronounce mercy, but it cleared its throat before cruelty. Petitions arrived creased by hands that had learned to crease paper carefully instead of with frantic fists. Men who had been invisible at corners lifted their chins half an inch when they carried baskets, as if baskets did not also carry them. A magistrate asked a question he had never asked another magistrate in 10 years of sharing morning bread. "Who profits?" The other man laughed, and then the laughter sounded like a cough in his own ears, ugly and true. None of this saved anyone from hunger. The stew pots still went empty at night in a dozen alleys. But a habit had blinked. In the house of black and white, they persuaded one another that blinkings were the beginning of sight. Jaqen learned the streets the way he had once learned the rooms of Winterfell, by the feel of the corners and the little cold that gathered where a door did not sit flush with its frame. He went to the fishmonger's square at dawn and watched the women set their stalls with the harsh Effie. Sciency of people who have no patience with the sea's jokes. He saw a gold cloak help an old man lift a tub of gray shrimp, and he saw another gold cloak flick a child's ear for no reason at all. He carried the first man's face a few hours later and returned a cloak to a tavern he did not owe coin. The owner told him he was a good man. He carried the second man's smell on his memory and took it into a counting house where notes passed between men who did not like to touch other people's money with their own hands. The note told a story of a theft, small and pathetic, the sort of thing that would make a captain who wanted to show justice move quickly to a visible correction. The wrong gold cloak was demoted for the right-wrong reason. The right-wrong reason made the wrong men nervous and the right men cautious. On the hill, a man who liked bears and metaphors and his own restraint coughed and sent for stronger wine. Jaqen worked with paper as if it were wire. He bent it. He left it with a memory of where it had been before it was bent. He murmured to capons and little bells and women who kept tallies of flour sacks in their heads, and to cats who sat upon their ledgers and dared them to tear a page with their impatience. He showed Jaqen where the city's weight sat. Not on the throne, not even on the men who washed the throne steps, but on the one who kept the buckets in order, who told a boy which step to wash first. When you moved the bucket keeper, the steps became a different thing entirely. Jaqen had known that the wall depended on the men who shoveled its latrines, but he had not thought to call it a lesson then. Now he did. At night, on rooftops, they spoke little. They had agreed, once, on a wordless oath against saying the names of the living when the moon was up. The house would have approved. The city was a thicket of knives and exhaustions and bargains. The nights above it required quiet if the day below it was to be moved without ripping open. And still the wolf in him paced. He could feel ghosts sometimes like a second breath, a double in the chest. The city's scents were wrong on that inner tongue. Tar and tallow and shit and spices. A confusion of human ambition he could not map onto snow and blood and pine, but there were lines even in the noise. Fear smelled like iron left out in the rain. Guilt had the tang of sour milk. He hunted by that. He learned what it meant to follow a feeling to a door and to stand outside it until the feeling changed, and to note who came and went and who never came at all to such doors. He learned the rhythm of the baker's boy who whistled only on days when the copper was light. He learned which priests slept and which did not, and which woke with prayers that sounded like returns on investments when spoken aloud. The third cord had been cut. The man who believed his gentleness was armor had died as gently as a man can die when a gift is given. The city had flinched, and then it had rearranged itself around the gap. The court whispered about illness. The mistress sold her ring to a woman who said she would guard it until morning and did not. A boy who had admired the scribe's beautiful hand began to practice lettering with care, making sentences about dogs and kings and shoes until his father came in and struck him for wasting candles. The boy learned to write in the dark. The court learned to read in a different light. Now the hand that holds the lash will feel a weight, Jaqen said, balancing a plum on the back of his wrist in a market where no one bought fruit with coins so bright. We will put stones into his pockets. We will change the way he moves so that the lash does not fall so easily. And when the lash does fall, we will be sitting behind the man who takes it and counting the numbers by which he will be paid for his pain. Jaqen thought of the twins again. Rope frayed quieter than bone, but bone remembered. And the Riverlands? He asked. A man prefers to work where wood is green, Jaqen said. But sometimes you must put your knife to bitter bark. We will go back. The river has not forgotten that the bell failed to ring. Rivers love patterns. When you move a stone, they love to never forget it. King's Landing did not miss them when they went. Kings and their cities rarely mourn the departure of what they have never noticed. The road out was a throat they stepped through, then the open country, then 100,000 stalks of grass making a sound like polite clapping when the wind walked. They slept in a hedgerow one night and the dew came on heavy and embroidered John's eyelashes. He woke to the faintest tickle of a spider walking his cheek like a man balancing across a rope, and he did not brush it away. He had learned to be kind to small things. The world is mostly small. He ate crust and hard cheese and a handful of nuts he had traded for with an old woman who had wrapped the nuts in a bit of homespun and told him he had good shoulders, like a man whose father had known how to lift without bending. He did not tell her that a man can be fathered by a lie and still learn to carry. They took the eastward path that moved parallel to the smaller streams feeding the greater. The water talked. John listened. In inns, Jaqen became a man who knew local saints and said their names with the sound a stranger makes when he does not want to be caught being a stranger. John became a sellsword with badly mended boots who could be persuaded to leave if you told him there was better work down the road. They were not remarkable. This was the point. Remarkable men are remembered. Remembered men are loved or hated. Loved or hated men draw shapes on the world that can be seen from a distance. They were moving in the spaces between shapes. The village nearest the crossing had changed in the weeks since they had mended kettles and lanterns. The flour in the cracked pot had dried to a paper curl, brown as a sparrow's back. Someone had put a sprig of green beside it, as if to teach the pot a longer season. The boy with the quick stare had a cut beneath his left eye, clumsy and healing badly. His mother had laced it with spiderweb and scolded him in a voice that sounded like a man sweeping a room quickly. He stood straighter when he saw John. John did not let his gaze linger. He did not change his step. He let the boy have the privacy of his pride and his injury. Inside the twins' shadow, the air tasted like old meat. Rot had its own bureaucracy here. Forms in triplicate, stamped by greasy hands. The kitchens were busier, angrier. The dogs were leaner where they should have been fatter, fatter where they should have been leaner. The steward with the itchy ankle had begun to wear his socks rolled down. Perhaps his wife had told him it made him look younger. It made him look ridiculous. A new bed frame creaked in the chamber of a daughter who had learned to cry without moving her face, so that tears walked out of her eyes like thieves and were not noticed even by the woman holding her hair back. The slack-mouthed knight had broken a tooth on a bone hidden in a pie. He spoke less. He spent his evenings with a flagon and a dog that would sit with anyone. If the city had changed its accent, the twins had changed their humor. Men laughed at the wrong moments and fell quiet when a jest deserved a laugh. The letter, the first one, had done its work. Those who answered it with their own letters had encountered small inconveniences when they went to collect what was owed them. A gatekeeper who had never before asked to see a seal insisted upon it, and held the wax up to the light as if he were a jeweler and found flaws enough to keep a man waiting. A barrel had arrived split. A tribute of grain had been weighed on a scale greased with lard. The complaints that followed traveled the little roads that run beneath the big roads. Wives' gossip, hostlers' grumbles. A priest's sermon with a little sharpness tucked into the fold of a proverb. The lord of the place had become more wrathful about the petty. Petty wrath is the most expensive kind. It costs large coin to fix small slights. "We pull two threads," Jaqen said. Eyes on the angle of a stair where a serving girl had paused every night for 3 nights to press her forehead against the cool stone. "The first is rotten. The second is strong. It will make noise when it goes. The noise will scare rats into daylight." John watched where the girl's hair was cut roughly across her neck. He saw the clumsy hand that had done it. The hand of a woman who had cut her own hair a year ago in despair and had kept cutting it since to prove that the despair had been hers to command. "The first?" he asked. "A cousin who counts coin by eating it," Jaqen said. "He bites each copper to be certain of its honesty, and so the servants call him Teeth. Teeth has sent boys to knock old men down for sport. He has paid men to forget shipments. He is not important, but he believes he is. He is the rot. He keeps the rot sweet with fear." "And the second?" John asked. "A man who prays," Jaqen said. "He prays to habit, not to God. He believes the prayers work because the tyrant still eats his dinners and the drawbridge still lifts. He will do nothing until everything happens at once. Then he will do anything. That is the noise." Teeth died 3 nights later. He choked on a sliver of bone, people said, eyes rolling up, trying to claw air out of his own throat. and the measure of pity he was owed was doubled because it was a ridiculous death for a man who had spent so much time putting his mouth to what he should not. Jaqen had placed the sliver where it would be found. He hated the work. It was petty, and the man was petty, and the gift felt wasted upon him. But the house taught that the gift was not measured by the nobility of the one who received it. The gift was measured by the corrections it enabled. With teeth gone, a ledger that had been kept hidden came briefly to light. Jaqen ensured that it was seen by the right-wrong eyes. The man who prayed, the steward who could make a levy appear by saying the word levy 3 times in different voices, did not sleep that night. He walked the hall and rubbed the backs of his hands together as if washing them with a ghostly soap. At dawn, he went to the old lord. The old lord was asleep with his mouth open. The steward stood there for a long time and tried to imagine how to wake him without waking the reckoning. He failed. Reckonings are always lighter sleepers than lords. When the steward finally spoke, it was to the wrong son, and the wrong son was the son who wanted to put fire to anything that promised to smoke. Soldiers were sent to shake boys awake in the village. Men with bills and spears tramped up and down and made noise. Someone struck the serving girl's ear because she had paused at the stair, as if prayer could still cool stone. Within the commotion, Jaqen walked from kitchen to cistern to meet Hook to chapel. He loosened a pin that had been hammered in too deep out of fear that it might someday fall out. He replaced the salt in one barrel with the wrong kind of salt that makes beans go hard instead of soft. He folded a letter that had been written by a man longing for a wife he did not deserve, and he changed one word. The word said remember. He changed it to remove. The wrong son found the wrong letter. He read remove as a command he had given in his own mind a dozen times and been afraid to act upon. He believed he had finally commanded himself. He sent 4 men to do it. 2 of those men were brothers who hated striking in the dark because they had, as boys, been locked in a cellar by a father who wished to make them brave. One was the sort who enjoyed striking in the dark because the dark made him feel powerful. One was the sort who would do anything so long as someone told him that it was necessary. Jaqen stepped into the path of the 2 brothers when the dark was wrong in the corridor, and the wind through the crack in the shutter carried the smell of a woman who had braided her hair for sleep. He carried no sword. He carried no face for fighting. He said a sentence that had saved men before. You will be named for this. They stopped. The dark bent around them like a bow. He repeated the sentence, and they repeated his words with their mouths open, as if tasting the shape of the future on their tongues, and then they lowered their clubs and told the 4th man that the steward had countermanded the order and that he liked to send one man to do things himself when he knew that wrong sons were watching. The man who enjoyed striking in the dark went alone. He did not enjoy striking on a stair where a serving girl had paused to pray her ear back to health, and where a rope that held a brazier had been nicked so finely that a little weight would pull it free. The brazier came down in a harmless mess of ash and embarrassment. The man's sword slipped on the stair. He cried out without wanting to. Dogs woke. Habits are nervous around dogs. The house woke in the wrong places and fell asleep in the wrong others. The old lord's mouth remained open. They left before dawn. Jaqen had his palmer's hat back on his head. The brim-shadowed eyes that had borrowed so many looks and returned so many faces to their pegs. Jaqen walked beside him as a drover with a limp acquired between this step and the next because it would serve them well when they reached the next town, where a drover with a limp was remembered for paying fairly and telling good jokes, and neither noticing nor telling when men who owed the Lord had taken back a bit from the Lord in the form of a half-empty sack. Will it be enough? Jaqen asked, not for the last time. The road took their words and threw some of them away. It will be enough for those who needed it to begin to be enough, Jaqen said. The twins will crack where they have always been cracked. Men will notice. Some will say they noticed before. Lies are a kind of hindsight. They went south and west and south again into the country where the air smelled like wheat and women's soap and the sleep of cattle. The reach spread itself like a table. Men in good green cloaks walked its lanes with hands behind their backs, the posture of men who had forgotten that hands can be used to build and break as well as to point. There was a lord there, not old, not gentle, whose men were too quick to swing the tithing chain. He paid poets to sing about justice and ran his granaries like a god who suffered from indigestion. We went to work in his shadow with the same soft weight with which we had pressed the city and the river. A woman kept the granary keys in a pocket sewn inside her skirt. She had lost 2 children and had not had another because she had decided not to risk loving something that could be taken away by the way winter used to cough. She counted without ink. Jaqen befriended her by borrowing the same measure twice and returning it once with a little flower still clinging to the lip where men would see him pour. He told her a story about a baker who had weighed loaves by lifting them and looking at the bottom of the world through the crust to see if the world looked smaller or larger. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her like a bird rising from grass, and she gave him a cup of beer that had remembered to be cold. The chain wardens took bread from mouths with what they called fairness. They measured fields too carefully when the fields belonged to widows and measured loosely when they belonged to cousins. They called it rounding. Beneath them was a man who made pegs for carts, whose son had been whipped for walking across a lord's meadow with a bucket of water because the well in the village had broken that morning and the next village's well had shoulders enough for 2 buckets. We gave the peg maker a reason to make pegs crooked and straight in alternating fashion. Carts built with his pegs broke the way good men break. Inconveniently, noisily, in places where other men are forced to see. At the same time, the granary keeper's keys stuck briefly in a lock because of a little oil that was not oil. Jaqen arranged for a clerk to miscount twice in one day in opposite directions. A harvest levy disappeared not into a belly but into a book where it could be seen to disappear. We taught the Lord's habit to step on its own foot and then asked the habit why it limped. When the Lord came to scold men whose carts had failed them, he did so with an escort. He liked to be seen while being just. Men like him always do. The escort wore the Lord's colors, and a captain among them wore a coat that had been mended like a peasant's in the way it had been mended by a woman who could make an old coat look new with a needle and love. The captain told the Lord that perhaps the pegs. The Lord told the captain that perhaps men should treat their Lord's roads with more respect and their Lord's patience with more care. The chain wardens watched and learned nothing because the chains made them feel taller. Later, the captain met a woman by a hedge. He did not touch her. He told her that he could not pay her brother's fine, because to do so would be to admit that the fine was too heavy. "Perhaps you might admit that the fine is too heavy," the woman said, and she did not weep, and the captain looked around as if someone might have heard the idea itself. Men are often frightened by sentences. Jaqen made sure that the captain heard the sentence again the next day in a different mouth, and the next, until it became a thought that woke with him and went to sleep after he did. We gave him gulls to listen to. Gulls criticize everything until they get bread. A harvest riot was prevented by there being just enough bread. We made there be just enough bread. We did this by making a wagon arrive on time because a man who had never once been angry in his life became angry precisely when anger did the most good. He refused to give up his place in line at the mill where his grain should have been ground first, not last. He did not shout. He simply stood, and there was something about the way he stood that caused men to look at one another and decide they would not push him. I held a door. Jaqen touched a miller's ledger with a little water and a pinch of ash. The sun was slow that day and gave us the hour we needed. The Lord, when he learned of the riot that had not happened, put coin into the temple box and felt better about himself. We put nothing in the box. We put something into the habit. At night, the reach smelled like cut grass and pride. I lay with my head on my rolled cloak and listened to the difference between a hare's pulse and a man's. Ghost ran in me under me. He padded along the boundaries of fields where men had set stakes. He liked to mark them. A wolf prefers his own lines. I let him run until stars bruised and faded and moved in a direction that could not be called east because east here had a taste of orchard to it and I did not want to name it. Naming is power. The house had taught me that. Winterfell had taught me that before the house did. We moved. The habit of the reach would not become kindness because we wished it. The Lord would not wake from the dream of his own justice and call it tyranny. He would die and his son would do differently, perhaps, if he loved a woman who liked peasants and believed in roads. This is a cruel way to say perhaps. We left men with better pegs and a captain who had begun to look at his coat as if it had been mended by all the women whose brothers' fines he could not pay. He would become dangerous in a year if the right petty thing offended him on the right morning. We did not plan to be there then. It is easier to plant than to harvest when what you sow is a thought. Dorn took us next, because Jaqen said water teaches lessons a river cannot. We went by the hill roads where the stones are redder, where the wind is a hand that likes to braid a man's hair out of spite. The men who ruled the dryness did not rule with whips. They ruled by owning cisterns and lending them out and writing names on lists so carefully that a man could be killed by an elision. We spoke to a water seller who had been a smuggler once and still dreamt of the sea when he set his jug down and heard it glug. We paid him to tell one lie twice and then the truth once in a place where he had never dared speak the truth because the truth here was a thing with edges and you can only carry so many edged things down a narrow street without cutting yourself bleeding before you meet the person you mean to hand them to. In a town that baked, a fountain had become a weapon. It threw more water into the air when the merchant whose keys were engraved with pomegranates walked by. He did not notice that it threw less at all other hours. A woman whose mother had forgotten her own language and now spoke in a stream of names that did not belong to anyone alive sat beside the fountain every day and combed her hair and watched everything with the courtesy of a person to whom nothing more can be taken. We made the fountain behave itself when the merchant came and replaced the sudden generosity with a failure at 2 other hours when it truly mattered. In the morning when the women came with their jugs and at sunset when men put their faces to the bowl. Water that does not arrive on time makes a ruler look like an accident. Accidents make cousins quarrel over locks. Quarrels bring to light keys that have never been seen, and keymaking tells you who thinks he should open things. We followed the new keys. We found a man who had made the pomegranate before the merchant stole it to be his sign. We put the sign back in the maker's hand with a story about patronage so cadged and polite that the merchant never knew he had been robbed of his heraldry until he saw it on a barrel of figs being rolled down the street by a boy who used the sign as if it had always been the city's. We gave the gift once there. I carried a wine seller's face and put my hands on the jug with the familiarity of someone who had been pouring for the same men for years. The man who died had kept a private cistern and made women go to it at night when fear is richest. He had made the price fear. I did not poison his wine. I salted his water. He drank the salted water because he liked to taste other men's thirst. He died as if thirst had decided to show him its second face. Men said the heat killed him. Heat kills most things in Dorne eventually. The only miracle is that men say that heat can also temper a blade. Let them say it. When we left, the fountain, properly shamed, became generous again and men flattered themselves that they had argued it into decency. Men love to flatter themselves. It saves them from admitting that strangers have leaned on their world and it has tilted. In the Iron Islands, the wind tried to breed with the sea on the rocks. Salt carved you into the shape of a man who believed in gods that love drowning. We went because raiding is a habit that feeds on other men's habits. We found a rope maker whose son had nearly drowned in a storm and who had never forgiven himself for loving the storm anyway. Jaqen spoke with him of hemp and hair and fraying and the difference between a rope meant to hold and a rope meant to show a thing being held. We taught him to splice in a way that would turn under load only when the load bore the weight of wet men climbing. Ladders failed. Raids washed back off hulls like rain. Men who had felt themselves loved by their god in the moment of stepping across a rail felt their god watching them idly, clipping his nails. Some of them stayed home the next season and pretended they liked the taste of potatoes. Some learned new prayers. One killed a priest behind a rock and took the priest's god away from him the way a man takes away a toy from a child who will choke on it. I dreamed differently there. Wolves do not like salt. Ghost trod inland and shook himself until his coat lay properly upon him. He hunted rabbits that had learned to live in the wind. I woke with sand in my teeth and a memory of a tree I had never seen growing from a cliff I had never climbed. I told no one. I watched men tie knots and pretend they understood the sea. The sea understands no man but pretends courtesy toward men who drown with their eyes open. In every place we left a knot wrong, a letter right, a door slightly less heavy for those who had to open it every day. In every place there was one man given the gift because habit required it. I gave it and did not grow used to it. I wanted to. The house would have wanted me to. The house likes its practitioners even. Even is reliable. I could not be even. Sometimes my hand shook. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes I prayed without thinking to trees that were not there and to a God who disdained faces and all the coins that carried them. Sometimes I spoke to the pool in my mind and asked it if it reflected my face or a face I had worn too long. Water answers only with the sound of your own voice, but the sound can be a lesson. My lesson was that I was not a man the house would have made into a priest. I could give the gift, but I would always carry the weight of who received it and why, like a man who carries a child too long after the child has fallen asleep. Tired my arms. It strengthened something else. There was a winter to the north that did not care what we did with ropes and letters and grain. It sent scythes of cold as heralds. Men spoke of it in the tone men used to speak of a debt collector they have heard is walking toward the village with a list. In the south, winter is story. In the north, winter is a king men hate and cannot depose. Bolton men had their own habits. It was time. We came to the dread fort not as travelers but as silence. The house sat as if it had watched men learn to hurt one another and had grown bored and wanted a new sport. The flayed man upon its banners did not shock me. It made me think of tanners bending over hides and of the way tanning makes the whole village smell evil. You can be a good man in a village that smells evil and still be marked by it. Jaqen wanted to go into the cellars. I wanted to go into the counting house. We did both. It is difficult to be subtle with men who have made brutality into a kind of art. They noticed the absence of fear the way a man notices a new hole in his cloak in winter. We made no absence. We brought fear to other doors than theirs. We frightened the tanners. We frightened the flayers' wives by telling them the truth, that their husbands would not live to see their sons men. Not prophecy, arithmetic. We frightened a kennel boy by showing him that a hound he loved had been fed badly to make it mean. He became meaner than the hound in the right direction. He bit a man who had thought he owned him. There is a right ferocity. You can aim it. We aimed it. The complaint that followed traveled upward in the wrong direction and struck a steward who had believed that cruelty could be organized like bingo. He died, not by the gift, by fear's second face. A sudden quilting in the chest when the heart says it will not beat for this any longer. The dread fort grew clumsy. Clumsiness in such men is rarer than one would expect. They are used to being exact with their pain. We made them approximate. You can die of approximation when you think you are a surgeon. Ramsay Bolton was not a habit. He was a hunger that had been rewarded too long. I did not go to him. I went to Roos. I went as a man who had served pie and poured wine and mended hinges and counted coin. I went with the quiet of a man who believed in his own insignificance, and I carried a letter that had learned how to fold itself so that men would trust it. Spoke of grain. It spoke of a levee coming late because the snow had started early in one valley. It spoke of a skin that had cost the Lord dear of late. If Lord Bolton's lip twitched when he read skin, he did not let it twitch where any man could see it. He called for a hooded coat. He called for two men who thought themselves invisible and who were good at it. He called for his son and did not receive him because his son was elsewhere, teaching fear to imitate him. He went down into the cellars and took the long way to the counting house, and in the long way there were doors that had not been opened in a season. There is always something behind such doors. It is usually not a monster. It is a ledger. He found 3. They smelled like tallow and regret. In one, the tanners had been owed too much and paid too often in coin that came from nowhere. In another, a man had taken to charging for the privilege of not being chosen for something worse. In a third, there were names that had been crossed out and then written down again and then crossed out again, and you could see the hands patience wearing. Roos had a stillness that could freeze a hummingbird. He read. He sent for men with authority. He did not send for his son. He took a needle from a drawer and sewed something small. I do not know if it was in his heart or his mind, but when he emerged from the cellars, he walked with the tiny difference of a man whose blood had decided not to flow in a certain vein again. What will he do? I asked Jaqen later when we sat on the low hill that watched the dread fort watch the horizon. A man will do nothing for a time, Jaqen said. He will do nothing so that it looks like he is doing nothing more carefully than he has ever done anything. Then he will apply a knife to a wrist. If he is wise, it will be his son's. And if he is not wise, Then someone will apply a knife to his, Jaqen said, and he made the small movement with his fingers that in the house meant nothing and everything. Acknowledgement that a thing had been set into the world that would do what it was meant to do without more hands upon it. We stayed until the first snow. Snow does not fall at the Dreadfort so much as it accepts an invitation to sit upon the stone and make it look beautiful. Beauty can be the cruelest mask. Men grew careful. Men did not laugh. The dogs ate. The tanners whispered about the smell. A boy who had dreamed of flaying a man the way he had seen it done in the yard began to dream of leaving. He told no one because leaving is the same as treason in some places. He carried the dream like a coin under the tongue. We went to Winterfell. I had not told Jaqen that I would. He never told me that he would come. We walked the last leagues apart and arrived together because some roads require two men to walk them to be believed by the road. The trees recognized me. The godswood did not forgive or accuse. It looked at me with its 1,000 years of watching and made me a place in its stillness. I went to my knees. I felt the old thing in me lift its head and rest its chin on my knee like a hound needing a hand. I do not know if I spoke aloud. The cold made my ears hum. The red leaves lay like tongues, like hands. The face in the wood had changed since I was a boy because people's faces change when you leave them long enough in the weather. It was more itself. So was I. Jaqen stood at the edge. The house does not kneel to other houses' gods, not from anger but from attention. They prefer to listen when others speak to their own. I will not be missed, I said, and this time I said it to the tree and to the house and to myself and to the winter and to the city and to all the men we had left altered slightly without killing. I will walk in it. I will be wet. I will not drown. The wind accepted the statement as if it had been said by 1,000 men before and would be said by 1,000 after. Perhaps it had. Perhaps all vows are rivers that men step into and out of. They are never the same river. They are always water. We went inside the walls as tradesmen who could mend a hinge. There is always a hinge. The hinges at Winterfell had learned to speak in winter. We oiled them with something that would not freeze. We did work and watched men who called themselves wolves act like men. Some were kind. Some were not. None of them were gods. None of them wore faces because they believed that their one face was the only one they would ever need. They were wrong. Everyone needs faces. Wolves too. I went where my feet remembered to go. I did not bring my hand to a sword. I stood where a boy had once stood and watched men swing practice blades and call each other names in jest that had never quite been jest. I went to the rookery and smelled the old straw and the truth of feathers. They are not symbols. They are what a creature puts on to survive. I folded a letter for a maester whose mouth tasted of old iron and who had never been asked in his life whether he had been happy. He had, once, with a woman who had loved words so fiercely that she had refused to say them aloud because speaking wore them down. He signed. The raven lifted. The gods would watch the sky cut by black wings and said nothing. It had seen all the cuts. There was a man there who had begun to turn kindness into a weapon. I have learned to fear that more than most things. He believed that the right way to rule was to make men love him so completely that they would not imagine what they could be without him. He would grow into tyranny the way a vine grows into a wall and pretends to be the wall if you look at it from far enough away. I put him on a diet of small refusals. The kitchen forgot his favorite soup. The stable boy saddled the second-best horse. The woman he liked to have sing asked to be excused because her throat hurt. He remained kind. That is the trouble with kindness when it is used. I did not give the gift. It is sometimes a gift not to give the gift. It is sometimes cowardice. I could not tell the difference that week. The house would have told me it did not matter if the correction held. The tree would have told me that all things matter and none of them matter. I breathed and let the two truths scrape against one another until they made a sound I could walk to. Jaqen changed faces faster at Winterfell. The North had less patience for fog. He could not speak in riddles to men who thought riddles were a way of saying you were from somewhere else and thought yourself better. He became the sort of man who knew which kindling wood would catch even when the wood had slept all night under snow, and he became the sort of woman who could carry a pail of milk without slopping a single drop, and he became a boy with a sore on his heel that made him limp exactly as much as was needed to make men want to carry his bundles for him. He kept his counsel. He listened to a soldier with a broken nose who told him that he had never seen such decent stonework in a keep, and that if the gods had meant to build such walls, they would have built them in the first place. They did, Jaqen said. They built hands, and men put the hands to work. We did a very little there because Winterfell was not the place that needed secrets so much as it needed time. We had no coin with which to buy more of that. We left before the first big snow. It came in a curtain and swallowed the road a league behind us and a league ahead. We walked inside a world that did not wish to be see-through. I liked it. Jaqen tolerated it with the patience of a man who prefers his limits visible. Where now? I asked when the snow went back to sleep in the ditches and the wind lost interest in our ears. The sky wore the flat expression of weather thinking about what to do next. The capital again, Jaqen said. Habits that sit on hills put down new roots quickly. We must pull one. Which? I asked. A ring, he said. Men who write letters do so in a ring. One dies and another replaces him, and the desk still smells of wax. There is a woman who mends the ring when it breaks. She is the habit. We will cut her. Another good person? I asked. I was tired of knives in people who kept worse things from being worse. She is good the way a wall is good, Jaqen said. It keeps out wolves and lets in men who wear sheep. A man has decided that the city must feel the wind for a season. The wolves are elsewhere. The sheep will learn to notice their own wool on other men's backs. We went. The road back to King's Landing has always smelled like the things men trade and the things they wish they could trade but cannot. Sons, daughters, griefs, old jokes. I watched a father teach a child to flick a fly from the corner of a mule's eye without getting bitten. I watched a mother teach a daughter to throw a stone in a way that makes it skip. I watched a soldier show a boy how to wipe his knife on grass and not on his breeches. Habits can be good. We forget that because the evil ones are so loud. I held those little lessons like hot stones in cold hands. The woman who mended the ring sat in a modest house where the street bent toward a temple, and where the fruit sellers were always a little disappointed because the light fell wrong and did not make their apples look as alluring as the apples in the next lane. She had a son who visited her twice a week with a careful expression that said he had decided to love his mother. He had married a woman who did not like the way he pretended to be good. She was right. He was still good. She was also good. It is difficult the number of ways good can be. The woman mended letters, not paper. She mended the little holes that gossip and cruelty and despair tear in a city's skin. She put men together with other men and women together with other women. And she did it without asking whether they deserved to be put together because she believed that loneliness is the only sin a city cannot forgive. She was paid in coin and favors and information. She was paid in the way a city pays those it truly needs. Not enough and almost more than one person can carry. She was dangerous to tyrants because she allowed men to love one another across the distances tyrants prefer to keep. Jaqen said we must cut her. He said it flatly. He did not say it with relish. He did not say it with sorrow. He said it as a tailor might say a seam must be unpicked if the coat is ever to fit. I wanted to argue. I had learned not to. I went to her as a man who had lost a brother. I told her a story that was mostly true. She listened. She drank tea. She said she could not find my brother, but she could find the man who had last seen him, and she warned me that the man would lie to me, and she told me how men lie and where they look when they lie, and she taught me, without knowing who I was, how to walk beside a lie until it becomes tired and reveals the truth by accident. I left and stood in an alley and put my head against a wall and wished for something I could not have. A world in which such women could mend rings without also mending the rings that contain evil. Jaqen brought me a little vial. I gave the gift. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It was necessary if we were to teach the city to feel the wind. The city would close around the hole she left, and it would do so badly for a time, and men would be chilled, and they would learn to wear coats, and some would say this is not what coats are for, and others would say coats are for everything, and a few would say perhaps we should build houses with fewer holes. I do not know if we did right. The house does not discuss such things except in stories about mountains that burn. I could not sleep that night. I listened to the capital moan. It did not like wind. I watched a candle and watched myself not blow it out even though it got aired and made the room stink of tallow. I wanted the stink. It felt like penance for a thing I could not name without losing my place in the work. There is a weariness that comes to men who do something difficult without anyone watching them do it. It is not the weariness of glory or the weariness of labor. It is the weariness of being a hinge. I became that. Jaqen saw it. He gave me little tasks for 3 days. Coins to drop, dogs to feed, words to misplace so that men would find them later and think them their own. He let me walk. He let me go to the river and take off my boots and put my feet into the brown water and feel it go around my skin and not carry me away. He said nothing as I sat there and remembered snow that would have made the water meaner and water that would have made the snow less hungry. We were not alone in our work forever. Work calls men the way a bell does. Some come because they are meant to. Some because they are curious about who is ringing. Some because they do not want to be the only ones not to have come if something happens. A woman found us who had once been a septa and had stopped being one when she had learned how to count the cost of forgiveness. A boy found us who had once been a pickpocket and had stopped being one when he learned that men value their names more than their purses. A man found us who had once been a knight and had stopped being one when he had learned that he liked sleep. I did not give them coins. I did not give them vows. I gave them tasks. The city began to produce other people who did what we would have done without being asked because they had seen something happen that seemed possible to them for the first time. An order not given by a lord was obeyed by the world. This is a dangerous moment. Tyranny thrives on men believing that only lords can command change. I wanted to stop them. I could not. Jaqen told me this is how movements betray themselves. They become visible. He taught me to make our work invisible by wrapping it in other men's attempts at similar work. We let charlatans take credit. We let small heroes fail publicly. We kept our hands under the table and opened and closed our fingers and moved the dishes an inch. Then a letter arrived with no seal. It was not a house letter. It was not even a letter in the accepted sense. It was a scrap of cloth with words pricked into it by a woman who had never learned to write and yet whose husband had taught her to sew very well. The pricked words said that a ship had left Old Town with a cargo that would change the way men killed one another in cities. It said that the ship would stop in King's Landing and that a man with fair hair and a crooked tooth would meet it with a purse and pay not with coin but with the names of men who had annoyed him, written on a list, tied with a twist that showed he had not learned to tie while at sea. It said a barrel would be rolled through an alley that could not be watched without standing on a roof, and that the roof belonged to a woman who washed clothes and liked to complain about the color of blood. It said, in short, that habit had invented a stronger lash. It asked, with the quiet of someone who expects not to be answered, whether the lash might be taken from the hand before the hand learned to use it so well that no one could take it again. We went to the woman who washed clothes. She was who the letter said she was. Unhappy about the color of blood, which discolors water and stains sheets and makes a washerwoman poor. She liked to talk. We let her talk. We asked 2 questions. We asked them opposite ways so that the truth, if it existed, would find one or the other of them comfortable enough to walk to our ears. Then we went to the roof with a basket and clothes and a pretense. We waited. The ship came. Men who called themselves dock masters moved like men who had been paid to turn their heads left when everything worth seeing was happening to the right. The fair-haired man with the crooked tooth had indeed not learned to tie while at sea. He had learned to tie in a counting house. He tied overhand where a bowline was required. The barrel did not fall. Teetered. It landed gently. He smiled at his own cleverness. He did not know that we were there because we did not tell him. He brought a fuse with his habit. He lit it. He turned to run. Jaqen stepped on the fuse. I lifted the barrel's lid. Habit had put fire to powder, and powder had not yet learned to love fire. I took the gift from the barrel, lifted it with a carefulness my father would have recognized as the carefulness with which he had sometimes lifted me in his arms when he feared I would break in a way no man could mend. We sent the barrel back to the ship. Men died. They would have died later, more of them, and wickedly. They died now, fewer, and unmeant by us. The dock masters became angry at no one in particular. The fair-haired man with the crooked tooth went home and drank and fell asleep with his boots on and did not wake. I had given him nothing. The house would say the many-faced God collects his own, sometimes through a man's fright. The city breathed in relief the way a man breathes after he has vomited and realized he is not dying of what he thought would kill him. We closed the alley by convincing an alderman that it was haunted. Men believe in ghosts easily in cities. We told a story about a washerwoman who had seen a boy with no eyes walking through a barrel, and we told it with the impatience of people who do not want to be pestered with questions, and so it was believed. We watched for 3 nights and then we left. There were more rings and more ropes and more pegs in the world. There were more gifts. I gave them as little as possible and as much as required. We cut names and did not say them. We built ladders in men's minds and moved them by half-rungs. We filled a church with women one morning by moving a meal by an hour and moving a priest by a story about a miracle that had not taken place in his youth and that he wished had. He found a new temper. Men in his orphanage found that their hands did not itch for their switches the way they had. This was a good day. There were other days. Ghost followed me to the edge of sleep and lay with his head on my ribs and let me know that he would always be the truest thing about me. Jaqen followed me to the edge of deeds and stopped and let me do them and then measured the angles afterward with his eyes to see if I had learned to cut straight. He told me when I had. He told me when I had not. He told me seldom. The work told me often. The work is indifferent to your feelings about whether it has been done well. The world answers with more or fewer children with full bellies, with more or fewer men with broken faces in the morning, with more or fewer women with spare coins under the plank beneath the bed. We became a rumor. It is useful to be a rumor if you can convince men to tell it to themselves in a way that fits their story. A tyrant hears of men who move without banners and thinks of assassins and grows afraid of his pillows. A priest hears and thinks of saints and grows expansive in his charity. A small lord with a medium heart hears and wonders if the moment has arrived when he might be brave without losing his family. Sometimes it has. Sometimes it is a decade too early. Planting and harvest again. Once, in a little village that had no name worth writing down, I stood alone in a square and a woman came up to me with a loaf of bread and said, without any more ceremony than offering me her hand, "You did something. We know you did. We do not know what. The steward is different. The way the bell is rung is different. The way men look at one another when the bell rings is different. You did something." I took the loaf. I broke it. I gave her half. "We did," I said, and I did not say who the we were, because we were as many as were needed and as few as could carry it, and it did not matter if the we were counted rightly so long as the bread was shared. Winter came down like a roof. We had put props under it. Some held, some creaked, some broke and were not noticed by anyone who could fix them in time. We cannot fix everything. Men tell you that you can when they want you to try because it means they can go to sleep earlier and wake later. I slept when I could. I woke when I could not. I learned to eat quickly and not to speak while chewing. I learned to stop before the last gulp and save it for someone who needed the image of being offered the last of something, because the image would make him brave enough to offer the last of something to another man later. This is currency too. When the snows were deepest, Jaqen brought me to a room without faces. He asked for mine. I took it off. It is not a thing you do lightly even when you have learned how to do it in the house. He looked at what was beneath and did not speak for a long time, and I saw something like pride and sorrow and a small flame of fear at the edge of his mouth. "A man has kept his name," he said. "I have had to," I said. "A man has kept his name and turned it into a knife he carries inside his coat, where it will cut him if he falls," Jaqen said. "A man would not advise falling." "I will not," I said. He laughed then, and he was briefly exactly what he had been when he first watched me speak of anger and chains. "A man forgets that wolves fall differently," he said. "They fall onto their feet and into snow that stands ready to hold them. A man has walked with a wolf and not asked him to learn to be missed. The house will not like it. A man does not always do what the house likes. The house is not a god. It is a house." He paused, then added, with that sly gravity of his, "The god is a god. We have given gifts," I said. "We have," he agreed. "Have we given enough?" I asked, and I knew the answer and asked anyway. "Enough is a song," Jaqen said. "Men forget the verses. They hum the parts they like. They tell one another that the song is complete because they have sung the chorus twice and the chorus is the part that pleases them. A man does not know whether enough has been sung. A man knows whether he has sung true. I went to the window. The city lay, the country lay, the rivers like black ropes, the roads like scars, the towers like teeth. Men in them were sleeping and waking and dying and making love and making bread and making plans and making lists. I put my forehead to the cold glass. The cold gave me back my heat in a way that felt like a bargain struck fairly. Behind me, Jaqen became another man, another woman, a boy, the kindly voice in a place that smells like old stone and oil and long patience. He became my friend. He had been my friend. This is a strange thing to say about a man with so many faces. It is nonetheless true. We went on. Winter takes a long time. So does unlearning to bow. So does teaching a habit to turn its head when it hears a cry and not when it hears coin. So does teaching a man to take his hand off the hilt and put it on the hinge. We did not finish. We did not think we would. We gave ourselves to the work the way men give themselves to a long road. By taking the next step, then the next, then the next, until you look up and realize you have learned the names of every bird that sings along the hedges and you cannot remember the face of the man who sent you on the journey, and it does not matter because you have become the kind of person who walks whether there is a sender or not. A lord died with his mouth open, surprised by his own heart. A lady lived long enough to teach her grandson to count the cost of generosity and still choose it. A soldier put down a lash. A tanner took a bath. A woman who had learned to write in the dark taught 3 girls to do it with a sharp stick and a piece of bark. A monk told a story about a mountain that burns and a god who gives gifts and a slave who asked to be released. And a boy listening in the back wondered quietly if the god liked wolves and if the mountain ever slept. Ghost ran tonight through snow I could not see. He stopped upon a ridge and lifted his nose and breathed a wind that had crossed the narrow sea and blessed a house without windows and knocked against the Titan's knees and slid between the merman's quartz columns and come inland along carts bolstered by pegs half crooked, half straight. He put his nose down and found me. He always does. I put my hand to my breast and felt the coin's edge. It was the color of storms. It had bought me my work and cost me my name, and it had done neither completely. I turned it under my fingers and then I stopped because I could hear a hinge complaining somewhere below, and a man with his hands full of wood struggling with a door meant for empty hands. I went down to hold it for him. I did not tell him my name. I did not need to. He thanked me. He said what men say when a small thing is done that will not be written down and yet without which other things might not be done at all. He said, "You're a good man." I am not. I am a man who walks in fog with a wolf who does not like fog and a friend who changes faces and a coin that has more than 2 sides. I am a hinge. I am a knife that stays in the coat and only comes out when there is nothing else that will move the world the little that it needs to move. I am a son who never stopped being a son and a servant who never learned to like serving but learned to do it well. I am a gift given sometimes. I am a refusal. I am a name kept and hidden and used to cut my own thumb when I put my hand into my coat too quickly. I am a man who will die one day and who hopes, foolishly, to leave the world with 1 habit fewer than it had when he found it. In the morning we will go to the docks, not to kill, to move a barrel from one ship to another, to tell a story about rats to a man who is tired of rats, to tell a different story about kings to a boy who thinks he will never meet one, to show him the hinge, to teach him to oil it, to walk away without our names, to keep walking until winter tires of itself and goes back north, sulking, and men come out with rakes and laughter and women come out with brooms and sharper laughter and children run into streets that have been theirs all along, to watch a tyrant look into a mirror and not like what he sees and smash it and cut his hand and bleed and try to call it sacrifice and be laughed at, to see a habit reach for a lash and find it missing and be forced to learn a new trick, one that looks like mercy. The house says the god wears many faces. The god does. So do men. So do wolves. So do cities. Today the city wears a face I can bear to look at. I will go out and give the smallest gift I can. The kind that weighs less than a chain and more than a cloak. Then I will eat bread and drink water and count the pegs in a cart and watch a man who has forgotten how to smile learn again when his wheel does not break on the road where it always breaks. Then I will sleep. Then I will wake. Then I will walk in fog. Then I will teach the fog to walk like a wolf. Then I will go on.